He was written as a deep-dyed, snarling villain, and he bored the out of me, because there is no longevity in deep-dyed, snarling villainy. And already I started to plan what I was going to do about that. Irwin not only allowed me to do that, but one day said, "Do more." And I did. And the rest, as we say, is history.
For decades, millions of viewers watched the Robinson family blast off into the unknown. They loved Robot B9, laughed at Dr. Smith's antics, and dreamed alongside young Will Robinson. But what if we told you that the cast members who brought this beloved show to life were keeping a massive secret the entire time? A secret so shocking that some of them waited until their final years to reveal it. And when they finally did, it changed everything fans thought they knew about the series. It all started in 1964, when television executives were desperately searching for the next big hit. Networks were throwing money at science fiction shows, but nothing seemed to stick quite right. There was hunger in the industry, a kind of competitive desperation. That's when producer Irwin Allen decided to gamble on something big. He wanted to create a space exploration show that would appeal to every single person in America, from children to grandparents. He needed the perfect cast to make it work. Here's the thing nobody talks about. The actors who eventually became iconic for their roles weren't even the first choices. They weren't household names. Some of them were struggling actors who had failed auditions for bigger roles. One cast member had been told repeatedly that they didn't have the right look for television. Another had walked away from acting completely before getting this opportunity. But despite their uncertain beginnings, these actors possessed something that couldn't be taught or manufactured. They had chemistry. Raw, genuine connection. When they stepped on set together, something magical happened. The network executives saw it immediately. This wasn't just going to be another science fiction show. This was going to be something special. Yet what they didn't realize was that behind those smiling promotional photos and enthusiastic interviews, something darker was brewing. Tensions were building. Secrets were forming. And the cast members knew things about the production that would have shocked fans if they'd known at the time. Do you think TV shows like this could even be made today with all the behind-the-scenes drama exposed on social media? But that was only the beginning of the untold story. The Robinson family wasn't cast the way you might imagine. There were no major stars demanding the lead role. Instead, Irwin Allen assembled a group of actors who were at different crossroads in their careers. Guy Williams, who played Professor John Robinson, was a veteran actor, but he'd been fading from relevance. June Lockhart, his wife on screen, had been working steadily but wasn't the A-list celebrity she wanted to be. And then there was Mark Goddard, who played Major Don West. He was practically unknown, fresh enough that the network could mold him into whatever they wanted. But here's what makes this fascinating: Allen knew something nobody else did. He understood that this show couldn't succeed with prima donna actors. It needed people who were hungry. People who would fight for their roles. People who understood this might be their last real shot at stardom. The production schedule was brutal. They were filming in Los Angeles during the mid-1960s, shooting episode after episode with minimal budget and maximum pressure. The sets were cramped. The special effects were primitive by today's standards. The scripts were often written just days before filming began. These actors were working 12, sometimes 14-hour days, dealing with heat from the studio lights, wearing heavy spacesuits that weren't designed for comfort. Yet something remarkable happened within those difficult conditions. The cast bonded in a way that transcended typical workplace friendships. They protected each other. When one actor struggled with a scene, the others would step in and help. When someone was dealing with personal problems off set, the family rallied. This wasn't an act for the cameras. This was real. The child actors on the set, particularly Bill Mumy, who played Will Robinson, became like real family members to the adults. June Lockhart treated Bill and Angela Cartwright like her own children. Guy Williams became a mentor figure. These relationships were genuine, forged in the fires of exhausting work and shared struggle. But what the public never saw was the pressure behind closed doors. The cast members were constantly worried about ratings. Would the show survive? Would they get cancelled after one season and disappear into obscurity? Some of them had families depending on the steady income. The anxiety was real and crushing. They smiled for photographs and interviews, but the stress was eating away at them. This is where the untold story gets complicated. The cast started noticing things on set. Strange decisions by producers. Unusual pressures from executives. Things that didn't quite add up. And they kept quiet about all of it. They kept their mouths shut for nearly 50 years. What happened next would explain why certain cast members carried such heavy hearts in their later years. When Lost in Space premiered on September 15, 1965, nobody expected what happened next. The show absolutely exploded. It didn't just succeed, it became a cultural phenomenon. Children across America were writing letters to the cast. Teenagers were collecting action figures. Parents were gathering around television sets every Wednesday night. The Robinson family had somehow captured the imagination of an entire nation. The ratings were extraordinary. Week after week, the show climbed higher in the Nielsen ratings. Sponsors were throwing money at the production. The network greenlit multiple seasons. Suddenly, these actors who had been struggling just months earlier were now walking down the street and being recognized. Strangers called them by their character names. Kids wanted their autographs. Parents asked them to visit their towns. For most actors, this would be a dream come true. The kind of success that most people in the entertainment industry spend their entire lives chasing. But for the cast of Lost in Space, something else was happening behind the scenes. Something troubling. As the show became more and more popular, the studio tightened its control. These actors were now property of the network. They were contractually obligated to show up at promotional events, sign autographs, pose for photographs. They couldn't turn down requests without facing serious consequences. Their public image had to be perfect at all times. They couldn't date certain people. They couldn't be seen in certain places. They couldn't express certain opinions. One cast member later revealed that they felt like they were living in a gilded cage. The success they dreamed of had turned into a prison of expectations. They were making more money than ever before, but the cost was their freedom and their privacy. What made it worse was the pressure to maintain the illusion. The cast had to go on talk shows and pretend everything was wonderful. They had to smile through interviews while sometimes dealing with personal tragedies off camera. One actor's family member was seriously ill. Another was struggling with personal demons that nobody knew about. But they couldn't let it show. The network had invested everything in the image of this happy, perfectly functional Robinson family. And then came the creative conflicts. As the show progressed, the cast members started having opinions about their characters and storylines. They wanted more depth. They wanted better scripts. Some of them felt like they were being stereotyped or underutilized. But when they tried to voice these concerns, they were shut down by producers who said, "You're lucky to have this job. Keep quiet and do what you're told." If you're enjoying stories that reveal what really happens behind the glamorous facade of television stardom, make sure to subscribe because the next part of this story gets even darker than you might expect. The truth about what this cast endured is something most fans never discovered. But the biggest revelation was still coming. The first season of Lost in Space was actually quite serious. The scripts had genuine drama. The characters faced real peril. The Robinson family's struggle to survive on an alien planet felt grounded and authentic. These were serious actors playing serious roles, and the show was thriving because of that balance between science fiction adventure and genuine human emotion. But Irwin Allen had other ideas. As the ratings climbed and the show became more popular, he made a decision that would change everything. He wanted to make it funnier. He wanted it to appeal to an even younger demographic. He pushed the writers to add more comedic moments, more slapstick humor, more absurd situations. The show gradually shifted from dramatic science fiction to campy entertainment. For some of the cast members, this was devastating. Guy Williams, who considered himself a serious dramatic actor, watched his character become increasingly one-dimensional. Mark Goddard felt like his talents were being wasted on repetitive comedy. Even June Lockhart, who was more adaptable, expressed frustration about not being challenged anymore. They were stuck in a situation where the show was more popular than ever, but the work itself was becoming less satisfying. One cast member later said in an interview that they felt like they were watching their own potential die right in front of them. They were trapped in a role that had become a caricature. Every script that came through was more ridiculous than the last. They had to perform silly moments and broad comedy while their serious acting skills atrophied. It was like being an artist forced to paint by numbers for years on end. The tension behind the scenes grew thicker. Cast members would question producers about script choices. They'd suggest ways to make scenes more dramatic or meaningful. Most of the time, they were ignored. The network had found a formula that worked, and nobody was going to mess with it. The cast's input didn't matter anymore. They were just performers, playing out predetermined roles. Many of us have faced moments when everything we worked for starts moving in a direction we didn't want. Maybe not in front of millions of people, but that feeling of losing control of your own narrative, of watching your talents being underutilized while everyone around you celebrates success, is something almost everyone has experienced at some level. For these actors, it was happening on a massive, public stage. The worst part was the isolation. They couldn't complain publicly. Their contracts forbade it. They had to smile and pretend to love the show at every public appearance. They had to laugh at jokes they didn't think were funny. They had to defend creative decisions they didn't agree with. The psychological toll was immense, and nobody outside the inner circle knew what they were really going through. Then came the announcement that nobody wanted to hear. After 3 seasons, the news came down like a hammer. Lost in Space was being cancelled. The network had decided to move on to other projects. Despite the massive fan base, despite the merchandise sales, despite the cultural impact, the show was done. The cast found out through official channels, not through some sympathetic conversation with producers who valued them. It was just a business decision. Cold. Final. Absolute. The reaction from fans was immediate and heartbreaking. Letters poured in from across the country. Children wrote about how the show had inspired them to dream about space exploration. Parents wrote about how it had brought their families together. Teachers wrote about how it had sparked their students' interest in science. The cultural impact was undeniable. But none of it mattered to the network. The show was cancelled, and that was that. What happened next was the moment that would haunt these actors for the rest of their lives. They realized that all those years of sacrifice, of compromising their artistic vision, of enduring the pressures and restrictions of stardom, had been for nothing in the eyes of the studio. The moment the ratings dipped slightly, they were disposable. The network moved on without hesitation. For decades, the cast members remained relatively quiet about this experience. They did interviews here and there, but they carefully navigated around the uncomfortable truths. They didn't want to seem ungrateful. They didn't want to alienate the fans who had loved them so much. They carried the weight of those unspoken resentments in silence. But in their later years, something shifted. Several cast members decided it was time to tell the real story. Mark Goddard gave interviews where he spoke candidly about the creative frustrations. June Lockhart wrote about the emotional toll of being trapped in a character. Even Guy Williams, who passed away in 1989, left behind personal journals and recorded interviews that revealed how much the experience had hurt him. For the first time, the public got a glimpse of what these actors had actually endured. The revelation shocked many longtime fans. People who had watched the show as children and felt deep nostalgia suddenly understood that their beloved actors had been suffering behind those bright smiles. The show that had seemed so magical on screen had been a complicated, painful experience off-screen. Yet here's what makes this story ultimately meaningful. Despite everything, despite the creative frustrations and the industry pressures and the disappointment of cancellation, the cast's work endured. Lost in Space became a cultural touchstone that influenced generations of scientists, artists, and dreamers. The show may have been campy and silly in its later seasons, but it represented something important to people. It showed families working together to survive impossible circumstances. It showed optimism in the face of danger. The cast members eventually made peace with their experience. They recognized that even if the journey was difficult, the impact had been real and lasting. They went on to have long careers in television and film. They became beloved figures at conventions and fan events. The very thing that had trapped them also gave them a kind of immortality in popular culture. But what most fans never realized was how close some of these actors came to complete personal breakdown during the show's production. The private struggles, the health issues that developed from stress, the relationships that fractured under the pressure, the dreams that died on set. These were the real stories that existed in the shadows of the spotlight. Before one of the main cast members passed away, they gave one final interview where they said something remarkable. They said that if they could go back and do it all again, they wouldn't change a thing. Not because the experience was perfect, but because it taught them about resilience, about the cost of fame, and about finding meaning in moments of connection with people they loved on set. That's the legacy that matters. The Lost in Space story didn't end with cancellation. In many ways, it was just beginning. Because this wasn't just about one show or one cast. It was about how the entertainment industry treats its artists, how success comes with invisible prices, and how the stories we tell ourselves about fame rarely capture the full truth. But this wasn't the only shocking chapter in the history of 1960s television. The next story about what happened behind the scenes of another iconic sci-fi show may be even more unbelievable, and it involves a lead actor who literally risked everything for his craft. In the final years of their lives, several cast members decided to break their silence completely. They gave interviews, wrote memoirs, and recorded personal accounts that revealed truths they'd kept buried for decades. These weren't bitter rants or attempts to rewrite history. They were honest reflections from people who had finally reached a place where they had nothing left to lose. Mark Goddard, in particular, became remarkably candid. He talked about the depression that plagued him during the show's run. He discussed how being typecast as Major Don West had limited his career options for years afterward. He revealed that there were times he seriously considered leaving the industry entirely because he felt so trapped and undervalued. But he also spoke about the genuine friendships that sustained him, the fan mail that reminded him why the work mattered, and how he eventually found peace with his role in television history. June Lockhart gave interviews in her later years that were both heartbreaking and inspiring. She talked about the discrimination she faced as a woman in the industry, how her contributions to the show were often overlooked, and how she had to fight constantly to be taken seriously as an actress. Yet she also spoke with deep gratitude about the legacy of Lost in Space and how it had given her a platform to inspire generations of young people, particularly girls who saw her character as a strong, intelligent woman navigating an impossible situation. Bill Mumy, the child actor who played Will Robinson, revealed something that shocked fans. He said that despite the difficulties and the pressures, he never regretted his time on the show. He credited the cast members, particularly Guy Williams and June Lockhart, with teaching him what professionalism meant. They mentored him through some of the most formative years of his life. He became a successful actor and producer in his own right, and he credited much of that to lessons learned on the set of Lost in Space. What emerged from all these revelations was a more complete, human picture of what had really happened. The show wasn't either purely good or purely bad. It was complicated. It had brought joy to millions while simultaneously causing pain to the people who created it. It had launched careers while simultaneously limiting them. It had been both a blessing and a curse, often simultaneously. The cast members who lived long enough to tell their stories did so with wisdom and perspective. They weren't trying to destroy the legacy of the show or turn fans against it. They were simply trying to make people understand that behind every piece of entertainment, behind every moment of magic on screen, there are real human beings dealing with real struggles. They wanted the world to know that success isn't simple, that fame has genuine costs, and that the people we admire are far more complex and vulnerable than we often realize. When the final cast member passed away, fans around the world mourned not just the loss of an actor, but the loss of a living connection to a show that had shaped their childhoods. The interviews and revelations these actors left behind became treasured pieces of entertainment history. They transformed Lost in Space from a simple piece of nostalgia into a complex human story about ambition, sacrifice, art, and survival. The truth is, the Robinson family's journey through space was never really about traveling to distant planets. It was always about human connection, about families facing impossible odds together, about maintaining hope in the darkness. The cast members who brought that story to life understood that message deeply, even when they were struggling under the weight of production pressures and industry expectations. Their legacy isn't just the show itself. It's the honesty they eventually shared about what it cost them. It's the reminder that the entertainers we love deserve our compassion, our understanding, and our recognition that they are human beings doing difficult work under challenging circumstances.